So it came in a hurry and it left in a hurry. And what am I talking about? I'm talking about the Emergency Measures Act. Welcome to Counterpoint. I'm Tanya Granick-Allen. On today's show, we're going to digest what just happened. How did this act get introduced, implemented, and how quickly it just seemed to evaporate? What are its lingering consequences? From whence it came and from where is it going? All those questions we're going to answer today. Later on in the program, we're going to have the head of litigation of the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms, Jay Cameron. But presently, we have Mike Donison, a retired elections lawyer or a retired lawyer with experience in elections, who has been a frequent commentator on this program. And he's going to help us digest and understand and really kind of unpack the issue of the Emergency Measures Act. Mike, thank you so much for joining me today.
Glad to be on your show, Tanya.
Yes. So again, this kind of all happened very, very quickly. And so many Canadians have so many lingering questions. But I think to kind of give us a basis for this discussion, could you explain a little bit of the history of the Emergency Measures Act?
Sure. There used to be an earlier statute, it was called the War Measures Act. And it was first introduced in World War I to deal with a war situation where a government needs to suspend civil liberties and take severe action when you're at war. And that was introduced for the First World War. It was used again in the Second World War with some modifications. And of course, we all know it was used by the current Prime Minister's father in 1970 during the Quebec crisis. Very draconian legislation. As a result of that, in 1988, Parliament basically repealed the War Measures Act, which is an act of Parliament, and replaced it with an act called the Emergency Powers Act, right? And it's been in place since 1988. It was brought in during the Mulroney government. And
so why in 1988 was it repealed and renamed? What was the impetus for that?
You know, I don't know the whole history of that. There was a lot of concern that there was excesses in the old War Measures Act. It was very draconian, much more draconian even in this legislation. And I think there was a concern that we needed something that sometimes could deal not just with wartime, but with the domestic situation. So this is quite an elaborate act. It deals with all kinds of different kinds of orders that can be made to deal with different kinds of so-called, I emphasize so-called, emergencies.
Now, you mentioned the Quebec crisis, which was, I believe, the FLQ crisis. And of course, as a student of political science, I remember studying that issue. So that was the last time the previous iteration of the Emergency Measures Act was invoked. Now, and that was by, obviously, then Prime Minister Pierre Elliott Trudeau. Now, his son, Justin Trudeau, happens to be the Prime Minister, happens to use the same mechanism. Some people are drawing parallels saying, well, you know, why are both these Trudeaus imposing it? When I look at the FLQ crisis, I mean, there were bombs, there were kidnappings, there were murders. We didn't see any of that with the trucker, you know, situation, if you will. Did we really need an Emergency Measures Act in this case?
Well, first of all, I think we need the act. I think there needs to be a standing act of Parliament that can allow the government in emergencies to take extraordinary action. I'm not against it, and it's a less draconian statute than the old War Measures Act. You're absolutely right, though. A lot of people think even what was done in 1970 was unnecessary. But at least, as you say, there was a known terrorist organization. A cabinet minister of Quebec was murdered. The British High Commissioner was kidnapped. There was even talk by Claude Ryan and others that there was an alternative government. I mean, you know, a lot of people think that Trudeau Sr. wasn't justified in what he did. But that was a very different situation from what we were facing with a bunch of people in trucks in front of the Parliament buildings.
Yeah, to me, the stakes seem a lot higher back then than they do now. So, you know, Trudeau Jr., Justin Trudeau, introduced this measure. What I found interesting is that there is a mechanism for this measure that it had to pass through the House and then the House of Commons, and then it had to go pass through the Senate. But he seemed to be able to use the capacities within the measure immediately. How does that work?
Well, that's the way the statute works. That's important. The statute gives what's called the governor and sections of the statute. In this case, what they declared was a public order emergency, right? And the cabinet has that power to do it unilaterally, in secret, just by cabinet order. And they did that. But what the act provides, unlike the old War Measures Act, is that once within 7 days of the cabinet doing that, it's in effect, but they must lay a resolution before both houses of Parliament, asking those two houses by majority vote to confirm the decision of the government that there is an emergency, right?
Right.
But meantime, the act and the proclamation were in effect, and of course the Trudeau government did that. They, as you know, they introduced the the necessary resolution in both houses.
Okay, I'm going to pause us there. We're going to pick this right up in just a few moments. Welcome back. We're discussing the Emergency Measures Act that we just sort of lived through that has now gone by the wayside. And joining us for that discussion is retired lawyer with an experience in elections, Mike Donison. Mike, before the break, we were discussing the process in which this emergency measure is enacted. So it's announced. There's a period where the prime minister can take immediate action, but then it does have to go through some sort of democratic process, goes through the parliament. And you were mentioning that they have to introduce something in the House, correct?
They have to introduce an identical resolution in both houses, in which it's a government motion. The government is asking each house, quote unquote, to confirm the decision of the government to proclaim an emergency. And it must be delivered within 7 days. The cabinet only has up to 7 days, and they have to get that tabled in Parliament. So
let's discuss the politics of that with this last go. I called Infamous Friday because there was a lot of, un-Canadian things that we all witnessed in the news, live camera footage of people being arrested, police in very heavy, almost militia-style gear, cops with guns in the street that we just are not accustomed to here in Canada. That Friday, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau decided to raise or lift the House or suspend the House from sitting. And was that, correct me if I'm wrong, but that was the day that motion had to be introduced. Was that the deadline? No, the motion had been introduced and debated on the Thursday. The Speaker, acting on his own, suspended. I actually think the Speaker, with due respect, violated the statute. The statute says the resolution must be taken up by Parliament and uninterrupted. There must be uninterrupted debate until the House decides the issue. Now, if the House can do whatever it wants, when I read it, I thought maybe the House passed a motion, to adjourn. But I understand the Speaker just ordered it. With respect to Mr. Speaker, I think he violated the statute. Wow. Okay, that clarifies some things, because I was wondering, were all these opposition party in cahoots with Justin Trudeau or cooperating to suspend Parliament for that day? Anyhow, so then what happened on the Monday? Well, that was the Friday. Well, then they came back and they debated it some more. I think they resumed debate. But then, as we know, I think it was debated the Monday and then the Tuesday. And of course, you had the spectacle of the Minister of Security, whatever title he has, Mr. Bill Blair, announcing that, this crisis has just begun. This is going to go on for a long time. There's foreign intervention. Well, that was on the Tuesday. On the Wednesday, the Prime Minister came on and announced that they had revoked it. Now, either Mr. Blair didn't get the memo, or I have to be careful what I say here, he was certainly dissimulating. How could the situation totally change in 24 hours? And because I think I know why. I was prepared for about a month long of an Emergency Measures Act based on what the Prime Minister was insinuating in his pressers. And then all of a sudden on Wednesday it was lifted. Are you able to speculate, or should I be the one speculating as to what I think will happen there? Well, I can give you a speculation. I think there was a danger that it was not going to pass the Senate. That a lot of so-called Trudeau-appointed ISG senators, who usually are kind of spokesmen for Trudeau, and I want to make reference particularly to a speech by a very eminent senator, Senator Delphont. He's from Quebec, Trudeau appointment, very much a Trudeau supporter in the House, ICG member, former Superior Court Justice. He came out and said that he was going to vote against the confirmation, although he reserved. But his main concern was, and so I think we should really be talking about, is the frightening economic financial provisions, which allowed people's bank accounts to be frozen. He came right down, he's a distinguished former justice, and he said, this is totally unconstitutional. It violates Section 8 of the Charter, which is called unreasonable search and seizure. He said, the idea that a bureaucrat could just order a banker to freeze your bank account, no notice to you, no notice after, and there's no obligation of the bank or the government to even give you reasons or even confirm your bank account is frozen. Right. And he said basically, no, there should have been judicial warrants. The act or the proclamation should have required that before you could do that, the government has to go before a Superior Court Justice and get a warrant, right? That there's some basis
for this person being connected with the blockade, right?
Will all those accounts be reinstated, or is that ship sailed?
Well, first of all, I just got to say it was an outrageous overextension of state authority, just absolutely outrageous, unjustified. I understand from reports the government, defeats the government's position, that in fact they've rescinded, they've undone all those cancellations.
Okay. We're going to have you back on, Mike. We're out of time, unfortunately, but this is a very exciting topic we have to stay on. Thanks so much.
Well, thank you, Tanya. Glad to be on the show.
We'll be right back. Welcome back. Now, joining me with his legal analysis and to unpack all the illegal innuendos with the Emergency Measures Act is Jay Cameron, head of litigation with the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms. Thank you, Jay, for joining us today. So let's start right off the bat. What is the present status with the Emergency Measures Act?
Well, the emergency has officially been declared to be over, Tanya, and that occurred against the backdrop of two events. The first was concern and confusion with respect to the stability and safety of the Canadian banking system because of the freezing of people's assets. And the second issue was a Senate debate that was no longer going in the way of the Liberal government's favor and looked like it might go against them on a vote. And so when those two things happened, the emergency was swiftly canceled.
Right. And I recognize that many Canadians, or I should say many, but some Canadians were concerned with whether their money would be fine, whether their accounts would be frozen. I heard stories of Canadians going to the bank and withdrawing money. Well, if many, many Canadians did this, that would obviously cause great concern for the central banking system. So with respect to the charges that were laid, the persons arrested during the, several days of the Emergency Measures Act when it was being enforced, are those persons still sitting in jail? Are people still being arrested?
There are still some people in jail, and there are people who are being arrested as the police go through video evidence, or as they run license plates, or as they investigate further. So there have been arrests recently, but most of the people who have been arrested have been released.
Okay, that's good to know. Obviously, with your organization, you proceed with many, many charter challenges. You're there to protect the constitutional freedoms of many of us. So what are your concerns with the Emergency Measures Act vis-a-vis the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms?
Well, so what people have to remember is that the Emergencies Act is supposed to be for the most extreme events, for absolute extremities. It's an extreme law for extreme circumstances. It's when all other avenues have failed. It was formerly the War Measures Act, and it resulted the last time it was invoked with the Quebec issue, with murder and kidnapping, and previously its invocation resulted in the incarceration of Japanese Canadians, and of course they never got their property back, and the Canadian government was forced to apologize to them years later for incarcerating them.
Camps that I remember.
That's correct. Right. So it's a terrible stain on the national image, and the War Measures Act gave way to the Emergencies Act, and it had never been utilized before. And so it says that a national emergency is an urgent and critical situation of a temporary nature that either seriously endangers the lives and safety of Canadians, or it seriously threatens the ability of the Government of Canada to preserve the sovereignty, security, and territorial integrity of Canada. And so the question that people should ask themselves is, did this peaceful protest in Ottawa, did that qualify as a national emergency? And the answer is not by a mile. It wasn't violent. Ball hockey and bouncy castles and truckers sitting in hot tubs does not constitute a national emergency. And that's why Canada has been pilloried in the national and international press for the declaration of an emergency. But secondly, though, the government didn't use the available avenues for a resolution. They didn't even try diplomacy or negotiation because the political elite were too arrogant to come out and listen to the concerns of the peaceful protesters. They just brought the police in. And so I think also you have to remember that there is a right under the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms to peacefully protest and to express yourself. And as long as you're doing that in a peaceful fashion, there is no time limit You can't just be dismissed by the political elite who say, go home and stop protesting. You also have to remember.
Let me interject for a second, though. I agree with you. I mean, from what I saw through my limited viewing of video footage, probably like the rest of Canada, I saw no violence. It wasn't really until the police showed up that things got really, really crazy. But there was the blocking of borders. There was the Ambassador's Bridge in Detroit. There was Coutts, Alberta. There was what seemed like a potential blockage of the flow of goods, which could cost our economy, hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars. Is that not an emergency? Does that not fit the bill?
Yeah, the blockades at the border had already been cleared. And there is a difference between peacefully protesting on the streets in Ottawa, which is the center of Canada's democracy, and blocking borders. They're two different things. But those blockades had already been cleared. And so the invocation of the Emergencies Act can only have been targeted at the peaceful protesters in Ottawa.
Oh, that's a very good point. Timelines matter. And in that case, you're right. They had been already cleared. We're going to pick up this discussion in just a few minutes when we return to commercial break, because I want to discuss more of what can be done and whether we will actually see another Emergencies Act hit our Canadian population. We'll be right back. Welcome back. We're discussing the recently implemented and recently suspended use of the Emergencies Act that we saw with the Ottawa protesters just recently. And joining me again is Jay Cameron, head of litigation with the Justice Centre. Jay, in order to impose or implement this act, one had to show evidence that there was concern that there was an imminent threat or violence or emergency. Has the government shown such evidence? They had several days in which they I guess they could have gathered that evidence and presented it to the Parliament, but everything then was retracted. So did the government at any point show sufficient evidence?
I think the answer to that question is no. And I think, given the fact that everybody has smartphones and there's a lot of video on the internet about what was actually going on in the streets of Ottawa, that it would be very difficult for them to do so. The War Measures Act was for war, and the Emergencies Act is for analogous extreme situations, which just didn't exist at that time.
Right. So given, that there, in your opinion, that there was a lack of evidence shown, and given that people did have bank accounts frozen and persons were arrested, what is the JCCF going to do about it?
The Justice Centre has filed litigation on this issue, along with other civil liberties groups, and I understand that there's litigation coming from governments right away. And the reason is because people had their properties seized without due process. And in the Western world, you have an understanding that when you work for something, you build something up, it's there for you to have. It's yours. You worked for it, and that the government is going to protect it. And that's not what happened here. They seized it without due process. The Emergencies Act is not due process, right? There was no convictions or criminal proceedings or court proceedings. All of a sudden, just your bank account is frozen. You can't pay bills. And so we represent ex-military and ex-RCMP officers who are decorated individuals who were peacefully protesting, or they were financially gave some contribution to the protest. And I'm sure their intention was to only support a lawful and legitimate protest. And so when their bank accounts were frozen, it was a big surprise to them. They can't pay their mortgage. They can't buy groceries. They can't, their whole lives are shut down. And on the thinnest of legal pretenses, because the government told the banks you have to do this, and the banks, instead of challenging that, they just complied with it. And so that's very concerning. It is a seizure under as per Section 8 of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And so there are a lot of legal questions that have to be answered, and the litigation has been filed.
And I think there were a lot of questions with some of the opposition parties, the parliamentarians, the MPs. There seemed to be even more questions or more of a hesitation to allow this to go forward in the Senate chambers. And my previous guest, he was shedding some of the more political background on that. It seemed that Justin Trudeau wasn't going to get this passed by the Senate. That sort of seemed to be the indication. There was the pressure from the bank, but there was also pressure in the Senate. Given that, again, it was quickly introduced and then quickly, I suppose you could say, suspended or withdrawn, how do you think your court case will go? And what's the timeline for something like this?
Well, first of all, it's been sent to case management because of all the parties that are involved. As to how it's going to go, the court is going to look at the Constitution and the Charter and And it's not going to have a difficult time concluding that this freezing of bank accounts and the extreme actions were taken that infringe the charter were a concern. The question it's going to grapple with is whether or not that's justified under Section 1 of the Charter, because the Emergencies Act is subject to the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. So it's going to be interesting to see what the court says. But on the face of it, people around the world have a lot of concerns about what happened in Ottawa with respect to government overreach and authoritarianism. And it won't be surprising if the courts also have similar concerns.
Well, in conversations, personal conversations with friends from various international countries, they were shocked that something like this could happen in Canada, or that there was such a tool that existed for the government to use. Given, again, the international collective shock, if you will, should we anticipate perhaps something like this being used again in the near future?
Certainly hope not. It's not for everyday use. We have hundreds and thousands of laws on the books in Canada that could have been used and simply weren't used prior to getting to the Emergencies Act.
Okay, well, that's all the time we have today. Thank you so much, Jay Cameron. I appreciate your time. So once again, that was Jay Cameron, head of litigation with the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedom. I'm still in shock that something like this happened in my time here in Canada. And I think hearing the collective awe from the world as the video footage of police arresting protesters on the streets of Ottawa is something that none of us will ever erase from our memory. For Counterpoint, I'm Tanya Granick-Allen.